He is one of the most enigmatic and beloved characters in Middle-earth and is making his live-action debut in The Rings of Power. But there's so much more to this merry fellow than just what we see in The Lord of the Rings. So we're going to go back through the history of Tolkien's writing and try to uncover the original Tom Bombadil. This isn't a video about Tom Bombadil, the fictional character. There are no theories about who he is or what he means to Middle-earth. Instead, this is going to take us before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and then right through their publication and out the other side. In doing so, this will be the story of Tom Bombadil, the literary creation, of what Tolkien wrote of him and when, of what was published and what remained on the cutting room floor. The original Bombadil fragment. Tolkien loved sharing stories with his children, and they were often inspired by their own little world. So he told them stories about a character called Bill Stickers, who he named for a sign in North Oxford. Rover of Roverandom was based on a toy that Michael Tolkien lost on holiday, and the teddy bears in Mr. Bliss were the Tolkien children's own teddies. But one of these stories had a far greater impact than any of the others. In the 1920s, Michael Tolkien had a Dutch doll, a toy made out of wood, that had a feather in his hat, a blue jacket and yellow boots. His father called the doll Tom Bombadil, and he used to tell his children stories with Tom as the hero of them. Tragically, only one fragment of one of these stories survives in manuscript. It is in the Bodleian Library and represents the very first time that Tom Bombadil was committed to paper. The story was set in the days of King Bonhedig. Bonhedig is the Welsh word for noble. And it was set in Britain. More specifically, it was set right where I'm speaking to you now, where the Berkshire Downs meet the Oxfordshire countryside. It happened in the days of King Bonhedig, before the wild men came hither out of Ond, or the dark men out of Euskardi, or the fair-haired warriors with long iron swords across the narrow water. In fact, before anyone ever mentioned in the fantastic history or sober legend had yet arrived in Britain, before the most far-reaching prophecies had even glimpsed Arthur in the distant and incredible future. Ond here is a pre-Celtic word meaning stone, which is why in The Lord of the Rings, Gondor means stone land. And the fair-haired warriors he mentions are clearly some form of Viking, so we're in a very ancient Britain here. Tom Bombadil was the name of one of the oldest inhabitants of the kingdom, but he was a hale and hearty fellow. 4 feet high in his boots he was, and 3 feet broad. His beard went below his knees, his eyes were keen and bright, and his voice deep and melodious. He wore a tall hat with a blue feather, his jacket was blue, and his boots were yellow. So here we have a merry Tom Bombadil, one of the oldest characters in an ancient kingdom. He is towards the taller end of hobbity height at 4 feet tall, and has a dwarfish beard and, by the sounds of it, belly. But we have to remember here, this is written in the 1920s. This predates The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and the makings of Middle-earth. And in this earliest surviving fragment, this is all we learn of him. We don't know what he gets up to. The 1934 poem. But by the 1930s, both Tom and some of the characters that form part of his story in The Lord of the Rings are beginning to be developed by Tolkien, but they're not being developed in prose as in the previous fragment. They're being developed in a poem. Work on this poem began around the year 1931, and the earliest surviving fragment of it is on an isolated scrap of paper with a heading written by Tolkien that says, "Date unknown, the germ of Tom Bombadil," so evidently the 1930s. What follows after this are 5 rhyming quatrains which begin, "Ho Tom Bombadil, whither are you going, with John Pompadour, down the river rowing?" And in the poem, Tom simply replies to this call, naming the people and places he is visiting as he travels down the river. And they are all wonderfully Bombadilian, with names like Bill Willoughby and Harry Larrabee, and places like Long Congleby and Bumby Cockalorum. This germ of Tom Bombadil, as Tolkien calls it, is a very simple poem, but he clearly developed the character further, because a couple of years later we get a new poem called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. That poem was published in the Oxford magazine in February 1934, an outlet for some other of Tolkien's poems as well, and my good friend Trotter from TolkienGuide.com kindly shared these images of it. The poem is printed over 2 pages and opens with what is now to us a familiar description of Tom Bombadil. Old Tom Bombadil was a merry fellow. Bright blue his jacket was and his boots were yellow. The adventure sees Tom captured in turn by Old Man Willow, some badgers and the Barrow-wight, but all he needs after he is captured to escape each time is to recite a little rhyme and he is free. And at the end of the poem he returns to Goldberry and marries her. But here, just like in that earlier prose fragment, we are not reading about peoples and creatures of Middle-earth as we understand it now. This very much predates them, and read in isolation they seem part of a different ancient folklore of Tolkien's own creation. The barrows that house Tolkien's Barrow-wight can be seen all across the landscape here south of Oxford, and it was only after The Lord of the Rings was published that Tolkien updated this poem in order to set it in Middle-earth, but more on that later. A sequel to The Hobbit. 3 years after Tom Bombadil appeared in the Oxford magazine, The Hobbit was published, the first published book set in Middle-earth. And the book attracted rave reviews, including from C.S. Lewis, who wrote in the TLS that the book will be funniest to its youngest readers, and only years later, at a 10th or a 20th reading, will they begin to realise what deft scholarship and profound reflection have gone to make everything in it so ripe, so friendly, and in its own way so true. I like that quote because it's important to remember here that there was once a time that there was a Hobbit without the Lord of the Rings, a place where Middle-earth was an altogether lighter world. The success of The Hobbit had Tolkien's publisher Stanley Unwin clamouring for a sequel, and thinking about how he could reply to this demand, Tolkien's mind turned to Old Tom. Do you think Tom Bombadil, the spirit of the vanishing Oxford and Berkshire countryside, could be made into the hero of a story? Or is he, as I suspect, fully enshrined in the enclosed verses? Still, I could enlarge the portrait. The enclosed verses mentioned is the Adventures of Tom Bombadil from the Oxford magazine, and so Stanley Unwin showed both this and Tolkien's letter to his young son Rayner, and it was Rayner who a few years earlier who had read the advanced version of The Hobbit and recommended that his father publish it. But this time, Rayner's report wanted Tolkien to go in a different direction. I think that Tom Bombadil would make quite a good story, but as The Hobbit has already been very successful, I think the story of old Took's great-granduncle Bullroarer, who rode a horse and charged the goblins in the Battle of Greenfields, would be better. As we now know, neither option for a sequel fully materialised, and instead Tolkien got to work on The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. The Lord of the Rings. With a full adventure story about Tom Bombadil off the cards, Tolkien decided to introduce him to the narrative of the Fellowship of the Ring. And so Tom Bombadil appears from the very earliest drafts for the book. These were written in 3 phases, and in our search for originality, we'll stick to the first phase here. And we can review these drafts in the 6th volume of The History of Middle-earth, The Return of the Shadow. And it's here that we first see Tolkien sketch his ideas for the Hobbit's encounter with Tom. His first mention is in a simple plan for the Hobbit's journey to Rivendell. Make dubious regions, old forest on way to Rivendell south of river. They turn aside to call up Frodo, get lost and caught by Willowman and Barrow-wight. T. Bombadil comes in. It's worth noting that the Frodo mentioned here isn't the Frodo Baggins that we know from The Lord of the Rings. It's Frodo Brandybuck, intended as one of the ring-bearer's companions, because in this early draft of the story, it's a character called Bingo Baggins who carries the ring. But more relevant to our story is the reappearance of not just Old Tom, but also Old Man Willow and the Barrow-wight. And in this version of the story, it's not Tom that is captured like in the poem. It's the hobbits who are captured and Tom who saves them. When the hobbits are quizzing Tom the next day, he tells them that he is an Aborigine, a term that we now associate mainly with Australian Aborigines, whereas in the eventual published version of the Fellowship of the Ring, he just describes himself as eldest. Tom's appearance here makes him something of an enigma. After all, that's why I'm making this video. But it's only a fleeting appearance. In this original version of the story, the hobbits stay at his house for just 1 night rather than 2 in the published version. although the events that they encounter together remain largely the same, including Tom being entirely unaffected by the ring. The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, 1962. This appearance in the Fellowship of the Ring gave Tom Bombadil an early fan base, and Tolkien received quite a lot of letters from readers asking who Tom was and what he meant to Middle-earth. One of these correspondents was called Peter Hastings, who sent Tolkien a detailed analytical letter with questions about Tom Bombadil as well as the orcs and the elves. In his reply to this and also similar letters, Tolkien was keen to keep a sense of mystery around Tom. I don't think Tom needs philosophizing about and is not improved by it, but many have found him an odd or indeed discordant ingredient. In historical fact, I put him in because I have already invented him independently and wanted an adventure on the way. But in the 1960s, Tolkien received a letter from his favourite aunt, Jane Neave, who rather wonderfully lived at a farm in Worcestershire that the locals called Bag End. And what she wanted from her nephew was a small book with Tom Bombadil at the heart of it, the sort of size of book we old uns can afford to buy as Christmas presents. And this time, nearly 30 years after he originally suggested a book about Tom Bombadil, we would finally get one. What Tolkien first had in mind for this book was producing something small, updating the poem that had appeared in the Oxford magazine decades before and producing a small illustrated book akin to those of Beatrix Potter. He envisaged a book that a child could hold in their hands with one verse on one side of the page and an illustration by Pauline Baynes on the other. And to begin on this, Tolkien updated that original 1934 poem in order to set it in Middle-earth. So, where in the original poem Tom lived down Underhill, he now lived up Underhill, where the Withywindle ran from a grassy well down into the dingle. This successfully locates the Tom of the poem with the Tom of the Fellowship of the Ring. And Tolkien also changes his outfit a bit, changing the original peacock feather in his hat for a feather from a swan's wing, as well as adding a green girdle to his description. His publisher liked the idea, but was rather disheartened that the poem only ran to 127 lines. To beef up the book, other poems, both related and unrelated to Middle-earth, were gathered together for possible inclusion, but they were still missing something, and so, contrary to Tolkien's original sentiment, he decided to write a new poem about Tom Bombadil. It was called Bombadil Goes Boating, and while the first poem connects Bombadil to Goldberry, Barrow Wights and Old Man Willow, the second poem gives him his relationship with Farmer Maggot. Tolkien's starting point for the poem seems to be inspired by that very first poetic fragment we looked at earlier that begun, "Ho Tom Bombadil, whither are you going? With John Pompadour down the river rowing," which is integrated here as, "We Tom Bombadil, whither be you going? Bobbing in a cockle boat down the river rowing." Through the poem, Tom paddles down the Withywindle, eventually meeting Farmer Maggot, dancing with his family and exchanging gossip. Both of these poems opened the eventual book, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, published in 1962. But despite the title of the book, it's only those two poems out of the 16 featured that feature Tom Bombadil. Many of the other poems had been written long before and weren't related to Middle-earth. And since Tolkien wasn't one to compromise on the integrity of his world, he felt this needed explaining, and so, before the first poem, he added a preface. We learn on the title page that these verses came from the Red Book of Westmarch, but the preface tells us that they don't form part of the main narrative of that book, The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings, nor any of the subsequent chronicles and stories held in there. Instead, many of these verses are found on loose leaves, while some are carelessly written in the margins and blank spaces. We learn that these poems appear to have been written by hobbits, particularly Bilbo and his friends, and were passed down to them and after them in the oral tradition. And I love that Tolkien does this because it's something he does throughout his books. He creates a bibliographic story for the stories within his story. Because in reality, all of the poems were written by Tolkien himself, long before he'd even invented the Red Book of Westmarch. And they were then passed into the story by him, into the Red Book, and explained in this book and its preface, which gives the poems a rightful and cogent place both in Middle-earth and in our world. As a result, we can treat these as kind of historical sources, things not entirely to be relied upon, and as a result we as readers are ignorant as to Tom Bombadil's true nature. But we aren't the only ones. In his preface, Tolkien writes that the Bombadil poems come from Buckland and show that the Bucklanders knew Bombadil, though no doubt they had as little understanding of his powers as the Shire folk had of Gandalf's. This means that we don't know Tom's true powers and true nature because the historical record passed down through Middle-earth and conveyed to us through the Red Book did not know them. And perhaps, with Tolkien himself being the hobbity creator of these verses, he didn't know his true nature either. Once upon a time. Now that would have been a nice and slightly poetic way to finish, but this isn't a story of simple beginnings and simple endings, because Tolkien wrote and published one more poem that features Tom Bombadil. It was almost certainly written after this book was published, and it appeared in an anthology of stories and poems for children called Winter Tales for Children 1, published in 1965. The poem was called Once Upon a Time and is more a poem about nature than it is about Tom's adventures. In fact, it opens with Goldberry rather than Tom, and although it talks of elvish lands, they feel to me as a reader more like the fairylands and elflands of Victorian fairy tales, the ones that Tolkien's wife Edith loved so much. Tom appears at the end of the poem, once upon a moon on the brink of June. And although he isn't named in full, he's clearly Tom Bombadil based on his disposition and penchant for rhyme. But if you thought that this final obscure poem might be the silver bullet for understanding who Tom Bombadil really was, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you. I've shown you all that we have, all that was left in writing, either deliberately or by chance, either published or unpublished. And after all of that, all that we do know, can know, or will know, is that somewhere on the Withy Windle, old Tom is singing.